The desert wind carried more than just sand across the plains of Kuwait and Iraq Gadai. It whispered tales of a silent, invisible enemy, one that followed soldiers home. Operation Desert Storm concluded in a swift and decisive military victory in early 1991. Troops returned to parades and yellow ribbons, hailed as heroes of a modern war. But soon, a disquieting pattern began to emerge among the veterans. An array of mysterious and debilitating symptoms started to surface with alarming frequency. Chronic fatigue settled deep into their bones, a weariness that sleep could not cure. Muscle and joint pain became a constant, unwelcome companion. Aches, memory loss, and cognitive difficulties, often described as brain fog, clouded their minds. Insomnia stole their nights, leaving them restless and drained. Rashes appeared on their skin, strange and persistent. Respiratory problems made each breath a conscious effort. This constellation of ailments would come to be known as Gulf War Syndrome. Initially, the Department of Defense and the Department of Veterans Affairs were skeptical. They suggested the symptoms were psychological, the result of post-traumatic stress disorder. Veterans felt dismissed, their physical suffering invalidated by the very institutions meant to support them. But the soldiers knew something was different. This was not just the stress of combat. They had been exposed to a toxic cocktail of environmental and chemical hazards. Hundreds of massive oil well fires, set ablaze by retreating Iraqi forces, choked the air. A black, greasy rain fell from the sky, coating everything in a film of soot and oil. Soldiers breathed this toxic air day and night for months on end. Then there were the pesticides, used extensively to combat the swarms of sandflies and other pests. Organophosphates, potent nerve agents in their own right, were sprayed liberally in living areas. Troops wore uniforms impregnated with permethrin, another powerful insecticide. The most controversial element, however, was the pyridostigmine bromide (PB) pills. These were given to troops as a pretreatment to protect against the nerve agent, soman. The use of PB was experimental, not fully approved by the FDA for this purpose. Soldiers were ordered to take the pills, often without full knowledge of their experimental nature. Many veterans later reported adverse reactions to these very pills. The specter of chemical warfare loomed large over the entire operation. Saddam Hussein's regime was known to possess and have used chemical weapons in the past. The constant threat of a chemical attack led to high stress and frequent alarms. In January 1991, coalition forces bombed Iraqi chemical weapons facilities. One of the most significant of these was the Qamishiyya Weapons Depot. In March 1991, after the war, US combat engineers were ordered to destroy the munitions stored there. They set explosive charges, unaware of the true nature of the depot's contents. The resulting explosion sent a massive plume of chemical agents into the atmosphere. This plume contained sarin and cyclosarin, two deadly nerve agents. For years, the Pentagon denied that any troops had been exposed. They claimed the wind would have carried the agents away from US troop positions. But veterans and independent researchers persisted, demanding answers. They compiled data, tracked troop movements, and modeled the chemical plume's path. Finally, in 1996, the official story began to crumble. Under immense pressure, the Department of Defense admitted the presence of nerve agents at Qamishiyya. They eventually conceded that as many as 100,000 troops could have been exposed to low levels of sarin. This was a stunning reversal, a confirmation of what veterans had suspected for years. A cover-up, whether intentional or born of incompetence, was now exposed. The admission opened the floodgates for research into the effects of low-level chemical exposure. Scientists began to study the synergistic effects of the toxic cocktail. Could the combination of PB pills, pesticides, and nerve agent exposure create a uniquely damaging outcome? Research suggested that stress could lower the body's threshold for chemical injury. The PB pills, meant to protect, might have actually made some soldiers more vulnerable to other chemicals. This complex interplay of factors provided a plausible biological basis for Gulf War syndrome. It was no longer just in their heads. Despite this progress, many questions remain unanswered. The exact number of troops exposed to various toxins is still debated. There may have been other chemical exposure incidents that remain classified or unknown. The long-term health consequences for these veterans continue to unfold. Many still struggle to get adequate care and recognition for their illnesses. Their children have also reported higher rates of birth defects, a terrifying legacy. The story of Gulf War syndrome is a cautionary tale. It speaks of the unforeseen consequences of modern warfare. It highlights the deep-seated institutional resistance to acknowledging inconvenient truths. And it underscores the sacred obligation to care for those who serve, no matter how complex or controversial their wounds may be. The desert keeps its secrets, but the truth, carried on the wind, eventually finds a voice. War officially ended, but for thousands, the battle had just begun. They fought for their country, and then they had to fight their own government for the truth. Each veteran's story was a single thread in a vast, tragic tapestry. The official narrative was one of a clean, technological war. The reality on the ground was messy, chaotic, and toxic. Low-level, chronic exposure was a concept military doctrine had not prepared for. The focus had always been on acute, high-dose chemical attacks. This new kind of injury, slow and insidious, did not fit the established models. So, for a time, it was easier for officials to deny its existence. The term syndrome itself was a point of contention, suggesting a collection of symptoms without a single, identifiable cause. But for those suffering, the cause was less important than the reality of their pain. Advocacy groups formed, led by veterans and their families. They wrote letters, organized protests, and spoke to any journalist who would listen. They built a community of shared experience in the face of widespread disbelief. The Camisea admission was their first major victory, a crack in the wall of denial. It proved that a chemical exposure event, once vehemently denied, had indeed occurred. This lent credibility to the claims that other, smaller exposures might also have happened. The science slowly began to catch up with the soldiers' experiences. Studies on animal models began to replicate the neurological damage reported by veterans. The link between the toxic exposures and the symptoms became harder and harder to refute. Yet a definitive diagnostic test for Gulf War syndrome remains elusive. Diagnosis is still based on a pattern of symptoms and the exclusion of other illnesses. This ambiguity continues to complicate disability claims and treatment paths. The government has since funded billions in research and established specialized treatment centers. It is a tacit admission of a problem that was once officially denied. But for many veterans, this response feels like too little, too late. They lost years of their lives, their careers, and their health. The trust between the soldier and the institution was broken. Rebuilding that trust is a process that will take generations. The secret truth of Gulf War syndrome is not a single conspiracy. It is a complex tapestry of environmental hazards, questionable orders, and bureaucratic inertia. It is a story of suffering amplified by denial. The final chapter of this story has yet to be written. The desert wind still blows, carrying the quiet weight of history. Soldiers returned, but they did not always return whole. The fatigue was a physical presence, an anchor dragging them down. Memories would fracture, names and dates slipping away like sand through fingers. The denial from officials felt like a second betrayal. The black rain from the oil fires was a biblical, apocalyptic sight. The PB pills were a daily ritual, a small act of faith in an uncertain shield. The Kamisia demolition was a routine task with catastrophic, unknown consequences. The Pentagon's initial models of the plume were tragically, fatally flawed. The 1996 admission was a crack of light in a dark room. The idea of a synergy of toxins was a terrifying but clarifying concept. The fight for recognition became a full-time job for many afflicted veterans. The legacy passed to their children was the most heartbreaking chapter. The invisible wounds of war proved to be the ones that lingered the longest. The truth was not a single secret, but at 1,000 small, buried facts. Each symptom was a letter and a word they were forced to spell out for the world. Air itself, the very act of breathing, had been weaponized by circumstance. The battlefield was not just the sand, but their own bodies. Official reports gathered dust on shelves while lives fell apart. The sound of a chemical alarm became a Pavlovian trigger for a fear that never faded. Researchers pieced together the puzzle, one veteran's testimony at a time. The illness created a chasm between those who served and the civilians they had protected. Healing was not just about medicine, but about being heard and believed. The war's true cost was measured not in dollars, but in chronic pain and stolen years. The desert landscape, once a theater of war, became a symbol of a vast, unanswered question. The silence from the government was a deafening roar in the ears of the afflicted. They were patriots who felt abandoned by the nation they swore to defend. The search for answers became a multi-decade odyssey. Each new study was a small victory in a long, exhausting campaign. The story is a testament to the resilience of soldiers and the moral imperative of truth. The chemical plume from Kamisia drifted like a ghost over the land. Soldiers slept under stars obscured by a toxic haze. The neurological symptoms were initially dismissed as mere anxiety. Veterans found solace and strength in support groups, sharing stories the world wouldn't hear. The fight for benefits was a bureaucratic war fought with paper and patience. The genetic legacy of the war is a question that haunts the next generation. The truth, when it finally emerged, was fragmented and incomplete, but it was a start. The Gulf War serves as a stark lesson on the hidden costs of military conflict. For those who lived it, the war never truly ended. It just changed form. The quiet suffering of thousands eventually became a national conversation.